Hello ladies, gentlemen and others, I'm Father Duke 8000 and yet again it's time for another Rare-based episode of Games That Time Forgot, where we tackle the remnants of unreleased titles, cancelled projects, irreversibly changed games, and whatever else we can uncover from the hidden, demented depths of the oft-overlooked world of video gaming development, and especially with Rareware's truckload of gifts from development hell. Today, we're going to be inspecting a game I've been playing through quite recently, Starfox Adventures. Love it or hate it for that Zelda-based deviation it took from earlier on-rail shooter installments, the possibly disastrous effects it had on the canon of every Star Fox game that came afterward, or introducing a character that's become the internet's biggest fap towel since Jessica Rabbit, Starfox Adventures is certainly a game that remains infamous to this very day. And that's not even getting into how the project came to be. For you see, Adventures wasn't merely an attempt by Rare to troll their fanbase on apocalyptic levels while they still had enough dignity to survive the heckling. No, the story is far more insidious than that. You better get your R-rings polished up, lads, because we're about to target generational leaps, genre shifts, and clashing Anglo-American voice actors in our search to discover the mystery behind the development history of Starfox Adventures. And I really need to stop rhyming these things. Back in 1997, Adventures originally began as a possible sequel to Diddy Kong Racing, as it was being worked on by much of the same team behind that kart racing classic that involved a blend between kart racing and platform adventuring. Though not much is known about this version or why the idea was soon aborted, it seemed that the main character for the game was going to be not Diddy, but one of the playable characters from the original, Timber the Tiger, seeing how some of the files describing the protagonist's actions use the name Timber. Whatever the case, the project soon moved away from its kart racing origins and took on various forms inspired by the countless pieces of concept art and designs done by Lee Shunman, until it finally became what lead software engineer Phil Tossell called a continuous world adventure game based around two interweaved stories, a game that would become known to the world as Dinosaur Planet. Made using the Zelda Ocarina of Time engine, Dinosaur Planet was planned to be Rare's swan song to the N64 by giving it a game so utterly groundbreaking in terms of its technical aspects such as audio design, graphics, and so on, that it would go down in history as the N64's Donkey Kong Country, a game that took inspiration from a classic but pushed the system to its very limits to become something far beyond that. This would be demonstrated by having, among other things, fully voice-acted characters, worlds that would dynamically load, and visuals that incorporated gorgeous lighting, jaw-droppingly beautiful locales, and amazingly detailed characters inhabiting it. The plot itself concerned a fox named Saber and Crystal the cat, siblings in blood raised by the mysterious wizard Randorn, who attempt to save the dinosaur-inhabited world of Saria from the horrible Sharpclaw forces led by the tenacious General Scales. While the plot is essentially the same as that seen in Starfox Adventures with a few alterations, as we'll get onto later, the overall story was meant to be far more complex and epic, involving, just to name a few, time traveling, mythical demons, and a saga that could very well have spanned an entire galaxy. The gameplay itself was also similar in that regard, though it shared many of the exact same locations and dungeons found in the final game, such as Dark Ice Mines and Cape Claw. One of the major changes was that Saber and Crystal would have had a world exclusive to that particular character, meaning you couldn't play as Crystal and Saber's set of levels and vice versa, and could only swap between the two via the Swapstone twins located at Swapstone Hollow for Saber and Swapstone Circle for Crystal. In addition, as the Swordmaster Saber had a sidekick to help him out in the form of Prince Tricky, the staff-wielding Crystal had a young pterodactyl named Kite to assist her over the course of the game. Though it wasn't really clarified how Kite would have been incorporated into the game, it's likely she would have had her own variations on the psychic commands used for Tricky, which were also witnessed in an inventory system that has a much less futuristic aesthetic, yet also seems slightly more intuitive than in the final product. At this point, Rareware had been showing off their game at numerous conventions and demonstrated a degree of openness towards their fans not seen before by offering them screenshots, nicely done pieces of concept art, character renders, and even music tracks via the game's website. Maybe they were very confident in the game's success and decided to simply show whatever they came up with to keep gamers excited. Whatever the case, things were soon to change for arguably the worse. Upon reviewing the progress made with the N64 version, Shigeru Miyamoto infamously commented that Saber looked remarkably like Fox McCloud, the main character of his at the time successful Star Fox series. From there, either by their own decision or by Nintendo forcing them to do otherwise, the Dinosaur Planet team retooled the game from the original IP to facilitate the Star Fox universe and characters within it, and this caused a considerable number of changes to the game in terms of its atmosphere and plot. Due to negative feedback from players regarding character swapping in Donkey Kong 64 and an alleged lack of difference between Saber and Crystal's gameplay, it was decided to make Crystal a non-playable character for the vast majority of the game, removing Kite from the plot altogether and leaving whatever levels meant for her to Fox instead. Speaking of which, Fox himself simply filled in the roles intended for Saber. Tricky would serve as his sidekick, he would use the mystical staff as his main weapon, and he even had the same voice actor. All the same, it was still planned to retain as many of the elements from the original version as possible, such as Randorn, the true mastermind being a character who wasn't an Aspal Andross, and a large myth arc explaining the history of Saria, besides it being simply your generic prehistoric planet. This was largely why the game was rebranded to Starfox Adventures Dinosaur Planet, a name that still lives on when you inspect a save file of the game on the Gamecube's memory card. And while we're on the subject, we may as well talk about another possible factor towards the game's rushed state: the transfer from the N64 to the Nintendo Gamecube, due to the latter being seen as the more relevant of the two by most at the time. Though this left the old concept about with a shitty port of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, the team decided it was for the best and continued onwards, working tirelessly to finish off the game. Though it didn't seem too difficult in transferring assets from one console to the other, similar to Cameo's upgrade from the original Xbox to the Xbox 360, it did mean spending more time fine-tuning everything they'd already done, where they'd soon need to get the game out into stores in a satisfyingly finished state. By the time development was starting to wrap up, Microsoft had bought Rare from Nintendo, and this meant that the team had to do whatever they could to get Starfox Adventures done. This included reducing the number of R-Wing sections that had been planned for the game, taking out a heck of a lot of dialogue involving the game's now bare-bones plot that remained on the disc regardless, and cutting short what was intended to be a dramatic battle against General Scales that now ended up as something that ended for no real reason. And with that, the now renamed Starfox Adventures was released to store shelves in 2002 as a very weird anomaly. It was the last Rareware game released on Nintendo consoles, it performed an extremely unusual genre shift for the Starfox series, and it ended up as a husk of what was intended to be something much grander and epic than anything ever seen before. Obviously, it really is such a great shame that an original IP that looked so promising had to be meddled with to such aggravating degrees, regardless of whether it was Nintendo's or Rare's decision. But what about the game itself? I've been showing you gameplay footage of what seems to be an N64 alpha or beta for several minutes, and you're likely curious as to what I think of it. Well, it's going to be a mouthful, I'll tell you what. For starters, I will give credit where it's due in terms of the presentation. The graphics are utterly astounding for their time, with spectacular lighting that really brought a sense of atmosphere to the world of Saria, even if some areas are a bit too dark and pop-up is annoyingly common at this stage of development. The music provided by beloved composer David Wise, many of which can still be found in the final game, provide a similar level of atmosphere through catchy melodies and a very relaxing sense of ambience trademarked by the man who gave us the similarly wonderful soundtrack to Donkey Kong Country 2. And though it's a little hokey by today's standards, hearing fully voiced characters in an N64 game is an impressive achievement given the format, and it's certainly nice not to be hearing that cringeworthy as heck Dino language rubbish that played the early levels of Starfox Adventures for no real reason. And then there's the gameplay. To put it simply, Dinosaur Planet plays pretty much the same as it does on the Gamecube. Now, if you like Starfox Adventures, you'll be glad to hear that, but as someone who thought it was actually quite terrible regardless of its connections to the Starfox IP, I wasn't exactly delighted. At the very least, there are a few things here that were actually done much better than in the final game. For starters, the idiotic item get cutscene was used much more sparingly for very important items, was much shorter, and even had a nicer jingle to it. Secondly, shooting magic was far more convenient since the controls weren't designed by a sadistic prat like in Adventures. And finally, it seemed like you could level up over the course of the game, as there are certain sections where Crystal kills formerly dangerous enemies within seconds. And given how tedious the combat generally is, that would have been a bloody godsend. Now, if only they could have fixed that sodding Lightfoot test of strength. And so, our investigation on Starfox Adventures Dinosaur Planet comes to an end. It's sad enough to see such a cool-looking, grandiose story get reduced for the sake of shoving in an established universe and characters who have literally nothing to do with anything that's going on, but when the gameplay is actually made worse in that transition, it becomes much more frustrating. I don't like Starfox Adventures, I'll make that as clear as day. I think it's a heavily flawed game that's got more problems that cripple it beyond the unnecessary IP shift. But even so, it deserved a far better fate than what it ended up with. I should be glad on the one hand that at least Dinosaur Planet exists in some form instead of being cancelled, but after what we've seen here today, I can only wish it got more than that. I'm Father Dugan 1000, and I hope you enjoyed watching this bittersweet penultimate episode of our retrospective for games that time forgot. Until we meet again for our final look over of the rest of their projects, have a great day, y'all!